Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Lisa mentioned, Paul and I are going to start us off with a bit of background. I'm going to talk about cost effectiveness methods for evaluating distribution investments, and Paul will talk about expenditure planning, multi-year portfolio planning, and objective setting. Next slide, please. There we go. I wanted to start off with a brief bit of context. So we have this generational opportunity to modernize distribution grids over the next decade or two. Forces driving grid modernization are diverse and they vary across jurisdiction. They include resilience and reliability, electrification, distributed energy resources, and new information and communications technologies. And in part because these forces are so diverse, commissions are really struggling with this question of how to evaluate the cost of effectiveness and allocate the cost of investments that expand and modernize distribution grids. Next slide, please. Part of this challenge stems from the fact that distribution investments are often lumped together in grid modernization or rate case proceedings. But for cost effectiveness evaluation and cost allocation, it's important to break investments out and categorize them both by type and what's driving the investment. For instance, in terms of types of investments, high-level taxonomy might include replacements and upgrades, line extension and service upgrades, capacity expansion, hardening, grid management, and administrative. Things like grid management software are more clearly aimed at modernizing the grid, whereas for things like upgrades and capacity expansion, the lines are somewhat more blurred. So a big reason to separate out investments is that we can better figure out what goes where, which investments should be included in traditional utility capital and planning, which should be in grid modernization plans, and which should be triggered through customer interconnection. Next slide, please. Different types of investments will have different drivers. So we've been using 4 categories. The first category is joint and interdependent benefits. So these are core platform investments that provide new capabilities and new functionality for the distribution system. The fact that they have joint benefits means that these types of investments are difficult to evaluate for cost effectiveness because they support multiple objectives. So things like higher reliability, lower emissions, lower distribution system costs, and customer choice. Second category is compliance and policy mandates. These are investments that are needed to meet safety and reliability standards and mandatory policy goals. Currently, most distribution investments are driven by standards. Policy mandates are an emerging category of driver. The third category is net customer benefits. These are investments that provide bill savings for all or a subset of customers. So AMI is an example of a distribution investment that is typically driven by net benefits, mostly in the form of capacity cost savings. And then the last category is customer choice. These are investments that benefit and are paid for by individual customers or smaller groups of customers. So these different categories of drivers have different cost effectiveness evaluation methods. Investments with joint and interdependent benefits and investments needed for standards, compliance, and policy mandates typically use a least cost best fit approach. Investments that have net customer benefits typically use benefit cost analysis, and customer choice investments are typically assumed to be self-supporting. That means customers are choosing them, so they're assumed to be cost effective from a regulatory perspective. I'm going to talk more about least cost best fit and benefit cost analysis in a second, but I wanted to note that all this framework seems a little bit complicated. This is really the framework that commissions and utilities have been using for many decades. Category that's a little bit new here is joint and interdependent benefits, but it's really not that new. And a lot of what goes in this joint benefits category is information and communications technology, so things like management systems. So this framework is not meant to be new per se, it's just somewhat of an adaptation of an existing framework that's been used implicitly by commissions for multiple decades. But I wanted to note that in addition to regulatory approval, one of the main things that we're doing when we do cost effectiveness evaluations, one of the main reasons for breaking investments out into these different category of drivers is to figure out who should pay for what. Next slide, please. I wanted to spend a bit more time with least cost best fit and benefit costs analysis, as it seems like there's a little bit of confusion about these two categories. Least cost best fit and benefit cost evaluation address different questions. For least cost best fit, the question is Given that we want some functionality or capability on the distribution system, or that we want to meet safety, reliability, or regulatory goals, what's the least cost way to do so? We use least cost best fit planning for most distribution network investments. The benefit cost analysis question is, will an investment enhance social welfare? So that means benefits are greater than costs for a subset or for all or a subset of customers. We use benefit cost analysis mainly for things like utility programs and procurement, including non-wire procurement. There's some overlap between benefit cost analysis and customer choice investments. So in some cases, investments that customers choose to make are also going to reduce costs for other customers, in which case there'd be a rationale for cost sharing through cost sharing mechanisms. Free footage allowances for line extension are a good example of this. If connecting a new customer is going to reduce costs or rates for other customers, then existing customers will want to pay for some of the connection costs. Historically, a good example of this has been the interconnection of large industrial customers with high load factors. But you'll notice from all of this that from a regulatory perspective, the most challenging category here is really least cost best fit. It requires objective setting and utility planning to determine whether and when investments are needed and which investments to prioritize when utilities don't have headroom in their rates. Paul's going to talk more about this in a minute, but I first wanted to go through a quick example of how this framework can be applied. Next slide, please. So say that we have a state legislature that develops a new statute requiring distribution utilities to meet minimum performance standards during extreme events. So this could be things like outage rates or service restoration times. This is top of mind for a lot of commissions right now. PUC orders the distribution utilities to go out and figure out how to meet the standards at least cost and propose both a plan for doing so, an infrastructure plan for doing so, and a spending plan for doing so. The PUC orders the utilities to integrate microgrids, which several communities in the area propose into this plan. So here's how this might work within the framework that we just discussed. So first, the law deems that major hardening investments, so this would be things like raising substations in flood zones. The law deems that these types of investments will be in the public interest, and it creates a source of tax revenue to pay for them up to the specified dollar cap. So these types of investments are going to be paid by taxpayers rather than ratepayers. Investments that exceed the cap and smaller investments that are needed to meet the standard are financed by the utility, included in the utility's rate base, and paid for by utility customers subject to prudence review. The utility, in evaluating these microgrids, the utility finds that net of wholesale benefits, the microgrids are not a least cost approach to meeting the performance standard. So net of wholesale benefits here means that when utilities evaluate the microgrid investments as part of their plan for meeting this standard, they're going to subtract the wholesale benefits of the investment of the microgrids from their costs. So what this means is that the cost of the microgrids included in the utility's evaluations are going to be net costs. Instead of having all customers fund the microgrids, the utilities create a microgrid tariff that compensates microgrid customers for the wholesale benefits they're providing to the rest of the system. Microgrid customers are going to pay for the net cost of the microgrid. So that, again, that's the cost of the microgrid minus any wholesale tariff revenues that they get from the tariff. And presumably, the reason why communities would want to do this is for the higher reliability benefits that the microgrid is going to provide. So in this example, you can see how you can combine investments that are needed to meet standards, investments that are provide net benefits, investments that enable customer choice in the same investment portfolio using different cost effectiveness methods and fairly allocating the cost among different types of customers. This example also illustrates how important it is to have transparent and rigorous utility planning to determine which investments should be needed to meet standards, should be used to meet standards, and the extent to which customer choice investments should be paid for by other customers, to the extent to which these types of investments will have net benefits to other customers. So there are also two other essential important ingredients and often overlooked ingredients in this planning process. The first is trust, not just between utilities and PUCs, but also among all stakeholders. And the second is staff capacity, both at utilities and PUCs. Without those two elements, none of this works. Tend to take these two things for granted, but like anything else, they require investment and maintenance. And so in thinking about the cost of effectiveness and in thinking about planning to meet standards and policy goals, it's really, really important to think about the kind of soft infrastructure elements. So with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Fritz. Next. So as Fritz was describing, one of the things we think about with distribution expenditure evaluation is really understanding the plans from a holistic standpoint. So, certainly we've been advocating for some time, looking at a longer time horizon and trying to get a bigger picture as to what may be needed in terms of grid enhancements and modernization holistically. Clearly, as Fritz said, there's a number of drivers that are underway that are driving potential investments or operational expenditures, and trying to understand that broadly. One of the things we think about, and Fritz touched on that, is really understanding what are the specific objectives that are driving the planning process. In many cases, as illustrated here, there are a number of factors that are really at play in terms of trying to set clear objectives for planning, as well as the priorities that are important for a particular jurisdiction and locale. So obviously affordability and equity, there are certain grid needs that may emerge as based on various environmental situations, and certainly, age and condition of a system. And other needs. There are policy and customer drivers that we've touched on. Utility constraints with respect to finance and resources, personnel, whether utility personnel or contract personnel. And we've currently experiencing a significant amount of inflation and other external cost drivers related to supply chain and other. This all interrelate in terms of thinking about implications on the cost of the system and what is most affordable, and how do we address a cost-effective distribution investment plan. Next slide, please. So within this challenge, there's an opportunity to think both at the project level, as Fritz was describing, but also at the portfolio level. So increasingly, it's recognized that it's not enough to look at an individual project and assess that one off, but rather, how do we think about this holistically as a portfolio? And is that portfolio of expenditures, both capital investment and operational expenditures, as may be needed, are they achieving the objectives that are needed in your particular jurisdiction? So this holistic approach from a portfolio is what we're going to focus on. And here, I'll talk more in the next slide, is really looking at a prioritized set of expenditures that are aligned to the urgency of the grid needs that really address any statutory or regulatory objectives that have been established within the potential constraints that exist for that utility, and obviously for consumer and equity considerations. And so, one of the things we're increasingly focused on, and we're seeing a number of utilities in the US starting to look at, and several states taking action on, is really starting to focus on something called what we call value spend efficiency. That is, are we getting the greatest value for a particular dollar expended by the utility, whether capital or operating expense? Again, to meet the multiple objectives that you may be desiring in your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So conceptually, what we're seeing folks start to look at is, in a very simplified process here in the upper chevrons, is a process to determine the grid needs, again, going to the overall objectives that we've talked about, looking at the potential solutions. What are those, whether they're traditional grid investments or modernization technologies, or non-wire solutions. What that mix is, then evaluating them on an individual basis, as Fritz was describing, but then within an overall portfolio, developing a multi-year plan that is both prioritized and optimized with respect to those expenditures, given financial and resource constraints. Within that is really looking at the specific planning objectives, and here there's 5 examples that are somewhat typical, but need to be developed specifically by jurisdiction, that would then be used to help evaluate and prioritize those investments as part of this process. One of the things that we note is that in particular, very few distribution investments only serve one purpose. And in most cases, any expenditure really can satisfy multiple objectives. And it's really important to get clarity from the utility as to what these investments are going to achieve in terms of various objectives. As part of the early part of the planning process, as an input into the planning process, it's important to have clarity around the planning objectives for your specific jurisdiction, for your particular utility, as well as prioritization, ideally, as to those specific objectives, because that can help inform both the needs identification process, but clearly at the last step in terms of looking at development of an overall multi-year plan that aligns to the particular needs of your jurisdiction. Next slide. And on this slide, we're just summarizing the modern distribution grid, the DSPX implementation document. This document covers a range of topics with respect to grid modernization planning. It includes some integrated distribution planning elements as well, and the process that I touched on briefly and Fritz described more eloquently is in one of the chapters in terms of the cost effectiveness framework. I think this is the last slide. Fritz, were you covering this one?
These are just meant to be for reference. Yeah. So there's a couple slides here at the end that are for reference.
Great, thanks, Fritz and Paul. So we do have time for a few questions. I don't see any hands up or any questions in the chat box while you're thinking about it. I'm going to ask a question that's really, I think, the biggest question on everybody's minds. Why can't commissions do a cost-benefit evaluation for all types of utility investments in grid modernization? And what's even the benefit of doing a least cost best fit analysis instead of a benefit cost analysis? I know that's a hard question, but that's really the question, right?
Paul, do you want to take a first go at that, or do you want me to?
Sure. Yeah, the challenge, and Fritz touched on this, increasingly, many of the investments that are or expenditures that are being proposed have multiple benefits and address multiple objectives. And so being able to do benefit cost on a particular project proposal or expenditure that's proposed, often it gets very complicated in terms of being able to assess the other objectives that it may be contributing to. The other is, and Fritz touched on this, the interdependence. Many, particularly grid modernization investments, are conjoined in terms of being able to achieve the overall system that you're trying to implement. So, for example, a communication network by itself doesn't really have the full value. You have to have software on one end and data sources that are feeding it. And so it's a more whole, you have to look at the whole system to understand what it's going to achieve. Often these take multiple years to implement, and there may be requests for expenditures that take each one in sequence, depending on how the revenue recovery process works, or cost recovery process works. So this gets more complicated in trying to assess on holistic. This is part of the reason we advocate for long-term plans, to be able to look at that overall picture, be able to assess that holistic, and then be able to determine whether a benefit cost makes sense or a least cost if these are more directly tied to meeting specific statutory or regulatory objectives or mandates.
Yeah, and I guess one thing to add is that historically, in planning the distribution system, we haven't done cost benefit analysis for most distribution investments. And part of the reason is we set a reliability standard for what level of reliability we want on the distribution system, and then we plan around what are the ways to do that. In principle, we could do cost benefit analysis on that reliability standard and then include everything in this one large cost benefit analysis. But as Paul mentioned, it would be really, really complex. And it would sort of lead to these situations that we've been getting into recently, where it's basically a thumbs up or a thumbs down for an entire portfolio of investments rather than individual investments. It's really, really hard to do capacity plan or to do network investment planning like that.